My girlfriend just told me she's pregnant, yet I'm medically sterile. Let me tell you, my life has been turned upside down, and I'm at a loss for what to do. Right after college, I was in a terrible accident. That fateful day changed everything. I was on my way home, minding my own business, when out of nowhere, another car came barreling through a red light and crashed into me. The impact was so severe that it left me with injuries I never thought I'd have to bear. Little did I know then that those injuries meant I'd never be able to have kids. None of my family members are aware of this. They know about the accident, of course, but the full extent of what it did to me, they have no clue. And you know what? In a strange way, it didn't hit me too hard mentally. I'd always been the type who was open to the idea of being child-free, so it wasn't like my world came crashing down because of it. I pushed forward and focused on my studies. Last year, I graduated with my master's degree, and I was on top of the world. All those late nights studying, countless cups of coffee consumed, it had all paid off. But there was one thing missing. I'd never really dated anyone. I was so focused on my education that relationships just took a back seat. Once I got my degree, my parents were all over me. They saw that high-paying job offer I got through campus placements, and immediately, their minds jumped to marriage. They were like, "It's time for you to settle down now." But I had other plans. I wanted to take some time for myself, explore the world a bit, and figure out who I was outside of academics and work. When I told them this, they were not happy. It was the first time I'd ever gone against their wishes, and you could see the disappointment in their eyes. But then, COVID hit, and it seemed like they gave up on the idea for a while. So, I thought I had some breathing room. I decided to dip my toes into the dating pool and downloaded a few dating apps. I was hopeful, scrolling through profiles, swiping left and right, but it was like searching for a needle in a haystack. No luck. That's when my parents stepped in again. They introduced me to a family friend's daughter, Priya. At first glance, we seemed to click. Looking back now, I was such a fool. She was always so agreeable. Whatever I said, she'd just nod and say yes. I'd suggest going to a particular movie, and she'd be like, "Sure, that sounds great." I'd mention a new restaurant I wanted to try, and she'd say she was up for it. It was nice at first, but after a while it started to feel off. I wanted her to have her own interests, to voice her opinions, but it was like she was just going along with everything I did. I didn't think too much of it at the time, though. Then came the big conversation. I told her that I didn't want kids ever. I was bracing myself for some pushback, but she surprised me by saying it was okay. I was like, damn, maybe she really is the one. In my country, finding a partner who's okay with being child-free is no easy feat, or at least that's what I thought. But we were still in the early stages, and I hadn't told her about my accident yet. Fast forward a bit, and we ended up having sex a month ago. I was always cautious, so I made sure to use condoms. But the very next day, things started to go south. She began ghosting me, a text here and there, and when she did reply, it was just one-word answers like okay or K. I thought it was because of my performance in bed, and I felt so self-conscious. I decided to give her some space, thinking she needed time to process whatever was going on in her head. Days turned into weeks, and her sporadic communication continued. I was constantly checking my phone, hoping for a more meaningful message from Priya, but it was always the same, brief and unengaging. Each time my phone buzzed, my heart would skip a beat, only to sink again when I saw her lackluster replies. I started to question myself, replaying that night in my head over and over, wondering what I could have done wrong. Then, out of the blue, yesterday happened. I was at home, just trying to relax after a long day at work, when there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Priya's entire family standing there. My heart dropped into my stomach as I saw the serious expressions on their faces. Before I could even process what was going on, Priya stepped forward and dropped the bombshell. She claimed she was pregnant, and she said I was the father. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. My mind went blank, and for a moment, I thought I was going to collapse right there on the spot. I couldn't form a single word as they started talking about marriage and all the arrangements that needed to be made. It was like I was in a nightmare, and I couldn't wake up. I managed to hold it together long enough for them to leave, but as soon as the door closed behind them, I was a wreck. I paced back and forth in my living room, my thoughts racing a million miles a minute. How could this have happened? I was so careful, and then there was the nagging thought that something just didn't add up. Priya's sudden change in behavior, her strange indifference after that night. It all seemed too fishy. Looking at the situation from a different angle, I knew I needed to take control. I called my boss and, with a shaky voice, asked for the day off. I needed time to figure this out, and I couldn't do it while being distracted at work. Next, I started making calls to local clinics. After a few tries, I managed to get a testing slot for Friday afternoon. I was determined to get to the bottom of this. Feeling a bit more in control, I then went to the store. I walked through the aisles, my eyes scanning the shelves until I found what I was looking for: pregnancy tests. I grabbed a couple of them, my hands trembling slightly. I knew I had to confront Priya, and I wanted to do it as soon as possible. So, I texted her, asking her to come to my place the next morning, which was today. But before I could even catch my breath, my phone rang. It was my mom. I answered, and before I could say a word, she asked me if I had any good news. I was so shocked by her question that I blurted out, asking her what she meant. She quickly backpedaled and played dumb, but I knew then that something was terribly wrong. This whole situation was far more messed up than I had initially thought. I hung up the phone and broke down. I cried like I hadn't cried since I was a kid. All the stress, the confusion, and the sense of betrayal came crashing down on me. I sat on my couch, tears streaming down my face, until the early hours of the morning. It was a long, painful night, and I felt completely alone. The morning sun peeked through the curtains, but there was no warmth in it for me. I'd barely slept, my eyes red and puffy from crying all night. I dragged myself off the couch, my body feeling heavy with dread. I knew Priya was coming, and I had to brace myself for what was about to unfold. I tidied up the living room a bit, not that it mattered much in the grand scheme of things. My mind was still reeling from the chaos of the previous day. I kept glancing at the door, my heart pounding with a mix of anger, anxiety, and a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a reasonable explanation for all this. When the knock finally came, I took a deep breath and opened the door. There she was, Priya, looking a bit sheepish, but behind her were her parents, beaming with what seemed like misplaced excitement. I'd specifically asked her to come alone, and seeing them there set off alarm bells in my head. I told them to wait outside, trying to keep my voice as calm as possible, but they didn't take it well. Her father started to protest, his face turning red. "We're here to sort this out as a family," he bellowed. I stood my ground, repeating that I wanted to talk to Priya privately first. After some back and forth, they reluctantly agreed, muttering under their breaths. I led Priya inside, and as soon as the door closed, she started to look uncomfortable. I didn't waste any time. I reached into the bag I'd prepared and pulled out the pregnancy tests. "Here," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I need you to prove that you're actually pregnant. The bathroom's right there." She looked at me in shock, as if she couldn't believe what I was asking. Then, without warning, she exploded. "How dare you?" she screamed, her voice shrill. I was taken aback. She'd never shown this side of her before. She stormed towards the door, yanked it open, and called her parents back in. Suddenly, the room was filled with chaos. Everyone was shouting at once. Her parents were accusing me of being irresponsible, of trying to shirk my duties. I tried to speak, to explain that I just wanted the truth, but my voice was drowned out. I felt like I was suffocating in the middle of this maelstrom. Finally, in a fit of rage and desperation, I yelled, "Enough! All of you, just fuck off." The room went silent for a moment, and then they all glared at me as if I was the devil incarnate. But I didn't care. I needed them out of my space so I could think clearly. An hour later, just as I was starting to regain some semblance of composure, my parents showed up. I should have known they'd be involved somehow. They walked in looking solemn, and then they dropped the real bombshell. Priya was never actually pregnant. It was all a setup, a plan they'd hatched with her family. They explained that they were worried I was getting too old to marry, and that they were desperate for grandchildren. In their minds, in arranged marriages, getting to know your spouse deeply wasn't necessary. They thought they knew what was best for me, and had been waiting for the right moment to spring this trap. I felt like my world had been shattered into a million pieces. All my life, I'd done everything they asked. I'd studied hard, gotten good grades, and followed their rules. And this was how they repaid me? I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face once again. I was sobbing uncontrollably, my body shaking with grief and anger. I sat there on the floor, my body curled up in a ball, surrounded by the wreckage of my shattered trust. The sobs racked my body, each one a painful reminder of how deeply I'd been betrayed. My parents and Priya's family stood over me, their faces a mix of guilt and defensiveness, but I couldn't bear to look at them. Finally, I summoned the strength to speak through my tears. "Get out," I choked out. "All of you, just leave me alone." My voice was hoarse and barely audible, but the message was clear. They hesitated for a moment, as if they couldn't believe I was serious. But then, seeing the raw pain in my eyes, they slowly turned and walked out the door. As soon as they were gone, I felt a strange sense of emptiness. The apartment that had once been my safe haven now felt cold and alien. I dragged myself up off the floor and stumbled to my bedroom. I collapsed onto the bed, burying my face in the pillow, hoping to muffle the sounds of my continued crying. For hours, I lay there, lost in a sea of despair. Memories of my childhood flashed through my mind. All the times I'd studied late into the night to make my parents proud, the sacrifices I'd made to meet their expectations. And now, it all seemed so pointless. I felt like a fool for believing that they had my best interests at heart. When I finally managed to compose myself a bit, I reached for my phone. I knew I needed to cut ties completely. I blocked my parents' numbers, as well as Priya and her family's. It was a small act of defiance, but it gave me a tiny bit of control in a situation where I felt completely powerless. I then turned to the one place where I thought I might find some comfort: the internet. I scrolled through social media, looking for anything to distract me from the pain. I stumbled upon a community of people who had gone through similar experiences, and their stories both comforted and horrified me. It made me realize that I wasn't alone, but it also showed me just how cruel the world could be. As the day wore on, I forced myself to get up and move around. I made a cup of tea, my hand still shaking slightly. The warm liquid helped soothe my raw throat, but it did little to ease the ache in my heart. I started to think about the future, a future that now seemed so uncertain. I knew I needed to take care of myself, both physically and emotionally. I made an appointment with a therapist for the following week. It was a scary step, but I knew I couldn't face this alone. I also decided to focus on my career. If nothing else, I had my job, and I was determined to pour all my energy into it. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The tears had stopped, but the pain was still there, a dull ache that I knew would take time to heal. But for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt a glimmer of determination. I was going to pick up the pieces of my life and build something new, something that was truly mine. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow across my bedroom. For a moment, I lay still, the events of the past few days feeling like a distant, yet still painful nightmare. But as I blinked away the sleep, reality came crashing back. I was alone, and my life had been turned upside down. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, determined to start anew. The first thing I did was clean the apartment. I picked up the scattered remnants of the previous day's chaos. The empty teacups, the crumpled tissues, and the papers that had been strewn about in my distress. As I wiped down the tables and swept the floor, it felt like I was sweeping away some of the pain and confusion too. With a clearer space, I turned my attention to my body. I neglected it during the turmoil, barely eating or sleeping. I went for a run in the park near my apartment. The fresh air filled my lungs, and the rhythmic pounding of my feet on the pavement helped to clear my mind. I watched the other people in the park, families having picnics, children playing on the swings, and couples walking hand in hand. At first, it stung, a reminder of what I thought I might have had. But then, I realized that this was my life now, and I could shape it however I wanted. Back at home, I made myself a proper meal. I chopped vegetables, sautéed them with care, and cooked some rice. As I ate, I savored each bite, knowing that taking care of myself was the first step towards healing. After lunch, I dove into my work. I had been neglecting it during the chaos, but now it was a refuge. I focused on the projects I had been assigned, losing myself in the details and the problem solving. It felt good to accomplish something, to have a sense of control. The following week, I went to my first therapy session. I was nervous, my palms sweaty as I walked into the small, quiet office. But the therapist, Dr. Gupta, was kind and understanding. She listened as I poured out my story, my fears, and my hopes. She didn't judge me for my outburst at my parents or my confusion about Priya. Instead, she gave me tools to cope with the emotions that were threatening to overwhelm me. Over the next few weeks, I continued to see Dr. Gupta. I learned how to process my anger and betrayal, how to set boundaries, and how to forgive myself for being so trusting. I also started to explore my interests outside of work. I joined a local book club and a photography class. In the book club, I met people who loved to discuss ideas and stories. And in the photography class, I discovered a new way to see the world. One evening, as I was developing a roll of film for my photography class, I realized that I was happy. It wasn't the same kind of happiness I had known before, with my parents' approval and the promise of a family. It was a deeper, more self-made happiness. I had rebuilt my life, piece by piece, and it was truly mine. I still thought about my parents and Priya from time to time. The pain was no longer a raw ache, but a gentle twinge, a reminder of the lessons I had learned. I knew that I had made the right choices, even if they were difficult. And as I looked ahead to the future, I was filled with a sense of excitement and possibility. I was ready to embrace whatever came my way, knowing that I had the strength to face it.